So we continue with our lectures on study design. So in this one, we'll then discuss the last series of designs where we're just introducing the concepts of study designs. So now we'll be discussing case control study, which is an example of an observational which is a type of an observational study design. So a case control study is an observational design comparing exposures in disease cases versus health controls from the same population. So we collect our data of exposure retrospectively. So remember, we use these diseases when the disease outcomes are rare, or we use it for diseases which are rare. So we select our study participants based on the outcome or based on the disease. So we select those with disease and those without disease. Then we look remember we discussed the concept of time, where we say retrospective, we're going backwards and in terms of time, where we then look if either the cases or the controls were exposed with whether if the cases or the cases or the controls were exposed in the past with whatever exposures which we'll be looking at. So this is the structural appearance of a case control and disease. We've got our cases, those with disease. We have our controls, those without disease, and it is part of our study design. What do we then do? We then look backwards now and retrospectively to see if for exposures. Remember, it's analytic epidemiology. We want to see the relationship between disease and exposure and disease. Remember, disease is the same as outcome. Exposure are the things or the risk factors which might cause disease. So this is if you put more into that diagram, we have our study begins here, it starts here. These are our study population. How do we select our study participants based on disease or on outcome? So we have got those with the disease and those without disease. Our cases are those without our cases are those with disease, our controls, those without disease. We then look backwards now and by asking them or by taking history in the past to see if they had, remember the factor is the same as exposure. If the exposure is present or the exposure is absent, the exposure or factor is present or the factor indeed is absent. So that's how we do this. So we start where in a population. How do we select our study participants? We select them based on the outcome or the disease. We will have those with disease and those without disease. We then look both in cases and in controls whether the exposure is there or the exposure is absent. So based on this, we can then do our analytic to see what are the risk factors of getting disease. So what are the strengths of case control studies? Case control studies, they're less expensive and less time consuming. Why? Because you're just having your cases and controls and you just, it's not like really complex. There's no follow-up time, but they're just looking for they're faster and easy to do. They are very efficient for studying rare diseases. Remember, why are they used for rare diseases? They are used for rare diseases. Why? Because it's very difficult, and for you to, if you've got a condition which is very rare, and remember discussing some of those issues in terms of denominator and population. But if you've got a rare condition, and it will be really it will be difficult for you to get adequate numbers to do whatever study you want to do. And so, but if you're using this case and control and trying to assess the relationship, it will be faster and easier. What are the limitations of case control studies? They are inappropriate. They are inappropriate when disease outcome for a specific exposure is not known at the start of the disease. We also have these issues which I've also been discussing, and the sequence of events which started the outcome or the disease, and that temporality between the temporality, the relationship between outcome. So for case control, you cannot actually really distinguish and which started either the disease or the exposure. So at times it might be difficult. Exposure measurements, they are taken after the disease has occurred. Remember, you select your study participants based on disease status. So because of that, it will be, you're actually measuring and the exposure when the disease and it is occurred. Because of that, you also have challenges in trying to understand the relationship between exposure and disease, which one started. Then disease status can influence selection of subjects. So remember, you are selecting your study participants based on their disease status. So because of that, actually, it can actually influence how you're going to select your study subjects. Then we have what we call case crossover studies. So case crossover studies. So just to summarize them, and they are a bit complex, and so this study is done within one individual, and so case and control components, but information of both components will come from the same individual, and so this for an example. Remember, at some point, an individual will be a case, and at some point they no longer be a case. This is like an example of when can an individual be a case. So the hazard period, which is the time period before the disease or the event onset. Then the control component, the control period, which is a specified time interval other than the hazard period. So the hazard period, that's the period during which, remember, we are using one person, because one person can actually pass through several events, several phases. But during another phase, they're actually within a hazard, but after some time, they are no longer. So I think I'm trying to think of another example where one person can be a case, and after some time, they are no longer, they can be a control. So I think it applies to disease status, and there are some disease status which resolve. For example, you have a disease, at some point you no longer have a disease, which means during the period which you had a disease, you were a control. Then the time when the disease, before the disease you were controlled, during the disease you were a case. So you collect information during both periods, and those are called case crossover studies, where one person can actually be either a case or a control. Then the next study design, which we'll be discussing, is a cohort. What is a cohort studies? So cohort studies is a type of an observational design study where we compare individual with a non-risk factor or exposure with others without the risk factor or exposure. So the difference between case control studies and cohort studies, we are selecting our study participants based on exposure status, and we then follow up those people, and we then follow up or look for difference in the risk, and we look for the difference in the risk incidence of a disease over time. So what are we doing? We have our individual with a non-risk factor or exposure with others, when others with the risk factor, will others without the risk factor or exposure. We then either look back or follow them up to see which of those would then develop the disease, which is the incidence of a disease over time. And we are looking, this is like the best observational study is compared to what. Then data usually collected prospectively, but in some cases you can collect the data retrospective. So you can have a prospective cohort, where you start with your study participants here, and then you try to, they've got the exposure, and some have got exposure, others they don't have exposure. You follow them up to see if they are going to develop the disease. Or you can have retrospective. So in terms of retrospective, what happens, you have what your exposures here, and then you classify your things according to exposures. Then you look whether they developed the gene, whether they developed the, you're looking back to see whether they developed the gene, the disease. So it just depends how we are doing your study. So for cohort studies, remember, if you remember the way which you are, this is like a prospective and this is cohort. Maybe if you're looking in terms of time, your study begins here and you have got your population. You are looking for factors. Factors, these are the exposures. So you're going to say either the exposures are present or they are present or they're absent. Then you then follow up or look back to see if they had the disease or they didn't have the disease. And in both ends, which is the future. So it's the same thing, eh? And in terms of a prospective cohort, we have got your baseline, we have got exposed and non-exposed. Then you'll be looking for outcome in both arms. And the same for retrospective. It is the same. You're not like really following up, but you are looking backwards. But the classification is always based on exposed and non-exposure. What is different is the time when you are doing the study. What are the advantages of cohort studies? Exposure status is determined before disease detection. I think that's one of the strengths of exposure status. Remember, I was mentioning the issue of temporality. For some of these studies, we always want to know which started the disease or the exposure. Because for us to really say this thing causes a disease, we need that relationship must be very clear to say which started. So for cohort studies, the exposure usually starts before the disease. Then selection of so you select your subjects before disease detection. Then one study can reveal several outcomes for each exposure. So again, that's the advantage of the advantage of cohort studies, because you can actually follow up your study participants, and at the same time, you can study several outcomes based on a few exposure. What are the limitations of cohort studies? They are very expensive and time consuming. Why are they time consuming and expensive? It's because there's the element of, if it's a prospective, it means you start with your study participants and follow them for a longer period of time. They are very inefficient for rare diseases or disease with long latency. So if you've got disease with long latency, those are the diseases where it takes time. Remember, we're starting with exposure, so from the exposure, we expect people from that exposure to develop a disease. So if a disease has long latency, it means it takes time, and it takes time for the people to show symptoms and signs. So they become inefficient. Why? Because you continue following up, and you never see you never really see your outcome developing because of the long latency. Then you also have the challenge of loss to follow up as you're following up patients. That's one of the challenges, and which happens with cohort studies. So cohort studies, as I explained, this kind of really summarizes the cohort studies. You've got your study population, which is free of you're starting by exposure status, which is the difference with case control studies. Case control studies, you're starting with outcome and looking for exposures. But for cohort, you're starting with exposures, then you're looking for disease. They can be either retrospective, where you're going backwards, or they can be They can be prospective, once you're following up your study participants. Then the last study design, which we'll be discussing, are experimental studies. So I think we've discussed this. The investigator can control the exposure. They can They can control the exposure, and this exposure can be given at random and to group So clinical trials are the most well-known experimental design, and they are very good in testing causal relationship between exposure and outcome. So that's the best type of study designs which you can have. So if we are doing an experiment, we are interested in the consequence of some treatment or some outcome. So the subject in the study who actually receive the treatment of interest are called the treatment group, whilst the other one who receive a different treatment are called the comparison group. So I think this is clear. And remember, we said experimental studies. What do? You assign, and you assign your exposure, and this exposure can be treatment, can be whatever, and we should also want to see what is its effect on the outcome. So randomized controlled trials and a design in which subjects randomly assigned to treatment or comparison group provides the most convincing evidence of relationship between exposure and effect. So it is not possible to use RTC, randomized controlled trials, they're also called RCT. It is not possible to use RCTs to test the effects of exposure that are expected to be harmful. So I think we will not really go in detail about randomized controlled trials, but at some level, if you're interested, you need to read about it. In most cases, there are a lot of ethical issues which surround RCTs. I'll try to expand a bit. Maybe I will try and create extra, a few slides again, where we repeat some of these studies for you to understand. But for RCTs, it's unethical actually to really to test something which is harmful. It is also unethical. Let's say, you want to, I think if you seen at the moment, there's a lot of debate around COVID, where people think, this drug works, and like chloroquine. So you can't actually also withhold. Let's say you want to test, the efficacy of other new drugs. You have to test it against a standard of care. You cannot also withhold some treatment which has been shown to work on other study participants. So there are a lot of issues in terms of ethics for RCTs. So in terms of a diagram, with your trial, it can be controlled or not controlled. If it's controlled, it can be randomized or not randomized. Then there are these issues of blinded and not blind, and of blinding and not blinded. We'll discuss them in detail. I also try to discuss these things in a few lectures. So in terms of a diagram, that's how a randomized controlled trial is presented. If you study population, you randomize, those who get intervention and those who get the control. So you'll be looking whether they will have the outcome of interest or no outcome of interest, outcome of interest or no outcome of interest. Then from there, you can then do your analysis, whatever you want to compare. Remember, the whole purpose of having this splitting of control, intervention, outcome, no outcome. We then have numbers, and numbers here, numbers here, numbers here, numbers here, and you classify according to this. From there, you can then calculate some measures of risk or some measures of whatever, of disease frequency, which you can then use to see if there's a difference between intervention and control. So as I said, randomized control trials, they're the gold standard of research designs. They provide the most convincing evidence for the relationship between exposure and effect. Why are they more gold standard and they provide the most? Because it's controlled. You as a researcher, and you control what's going, and you control in terms of who is going to get what. And there's also the issue of randomization, where you randomize, your study participants. What are the disadvantages? Yes, they are the gold standard, but they've got very issues. They are very expensive. They are not appropriate to answer certain questions. Remember, I think we discussed this issue of ethics around randomized controlled trials, where it might be unethical to assign patients to a certain treatment or a comparison group. Or it might also be unethical not to give people a certain treatment which have been seen to work. So there are a whole lot of issues in terms of randomized control trials, in terms of ethics and others, and other issues. So I think this is the end of the lecture of the series of lectures on epidemiologic studies. We'll try and also give you some more lectures where we discuss these issues in detail. But please take time to read these things alone so that you also understand them.